Prynawn da. I'm Claire Morgan, Strategic Director at Estyn. Thank you very much for joining us for another Estyn live event. Today we're hosting a Q&A session about a thematic report we published in May of this year, developing pupils' English reading skills from ages 10 to 14. Just before we start, there's some housekeeping information. If you'd like to watch this event in a different language, there's a button to switch languages right at the top of this page, plus a link below this video. And if you have a question, please type it in the chat box in Welsh or English, and we'll do our best to answer as many as possible. Now, we all know the importance of reading for pupil success in school and in life beyond school. Reading is also a ministerial priority, and Jeremy Miles, the Minister for Education and the Welsh Language, asked Estyn to look at how schools are developing pupils' English reading skills in Year 6 and also from 7 through to 9. He also asked us to look at what was happening as transition. So for a bit of context, the last PISA results were published in December 2019. And these suggested that pupils in Wales had made some progress in improving their reading skills since the last time PISA focused on reading skills. However, pupils in Wales were still lagging behind those in other countries in the UK. This afternoon, I'm joined by a panel of experts. But before I introduce them to you, we're going to play a short video which summarises the key findings of our recent report. And in the introduction, Alan Tootle, the report's author, will share with us some of the more interesting points in the report. So let's have a look at the video.
The report is based on visits to a range of primary, secondary and all-age schools of different types and sizes across Wales, and on inspection reports from a further 98 schools carried out between January 2021 and October 2022. The report looks at standards of reading, provision for developing reading skills, and how some schools are seeking to develop a reading culture. A couple of the more interesting findings about standards include, while the pandemic obviously had a negative impact on reading standards, in schools which have identified specific skills gaps and taken steps to fill these deficits, pupils have made rapid gains since face-to-face teaching resumed. In general, more pupils in Year 6 are making good progress in developing their reading skills, including advanced reading skills such as summarising or evaluating, than in Years 7 to 9. This is partly because of the greater complexity of planning and coordinating an effective programme to develop advanced reading skills across many subjects and teachers in secondary schools. A few of the more interesting findings about provision to develop reading skills include, where provision is strongest, schools have identified evidence-based strategies to develop pupils' reading skills, and leaders have provided staff with effective professional learning so that they understand the purpose of each strategy, when it should be used, and how to use it. The majority of primary schools and a few secondary schools are thinking carefully about the texts they choose to read with pupils across the curriculum. This includes the balance of fiction and non-fiction and the progressive complexity of texts. Introducing more challenging texts is successful when teachers model the strategies pupils need to access these texts and provide them with appropriate support. Overall, provision for pupils to analyse and evaluate multimodal and media texts is underdeveloped in the upper primary and lower secondary phases. In most primary schools, pupils read aloud regularly, but only a few secondary schools have a consistent approach that supports pupils to develop these skills. Planning for the progressive development of pupil skills, particularly their reading skills, from Year 6 to Year 7 is underdeveloped in nearly all schools across Wales. School improvement services provide school staff with professional learning opportunities relating to developing pupils' reading skills, but these are too variable in quality across Wales. A couple of more important findings about creating a reading culture include: one of the most important factors is that senior leaders clearly support reading and ensure that it has a high profile among staff and pupils. A school library that is welcoming, accessible, well stocked, supervised regularly, and used well by many classes contributes helpfully to developing a reading culture within a school. The report makes 7 recommendations, including some for school leaders, teachers, school improvement partners, and the Welsh Government. These are appearing on screen now for you to think about. The report also summarises 8 case studies of good practice from 5 schools. Appendix 1 lists the key features of an effective programme to develop pupils' reading skills in years 6 to 9, and Appendix 2 lists the key elements in developing a reading culture in school. We would love to discuss the findings and the recommendations with you, and now is the chance to ask questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. I'd now like to introduce our Q&A panel for today. So you should see them all now on screen. So we have Alan Tootle, HMI, and the report's author, we've just seen in the introduction. Helen Thomas, HMI, was part of the team carrying out the visits to school. And a special welcome to our 2 head teachers, Owen Morgan, head teacher of Cyfarthfa Park Primary School in Merthyr Tydfil, and Lindsay Hastings, head teacher of Ysgol Bryngellion in Old Colwyn. So both schools feature in the case studies in the report. So let's move on to the Q&A session. So please add your questions in the box below. And I'm hoping that my colleagues have also added the recommendations from the report to the chat. So you should be able to see those as well now. So let's have a look at the questions. Okay, should we start with this one? Many pupils' reading skills have suffered as a result of the pandemic. Should we be worried? So, Alan, should we be worried?
Good afternoon. I think the first thing to say is that it's no surprise at all that pupils' reading skills suffered as a result of the pandemic. If you think of the very different experiences that pupils had across Wales during that particular time, we know that a minority of pupils didn't engage well with online learning during lockdowns and so on. And we also know, of course, that reading is not just an individual activity, it's also a social activity. And in fact, in schools, the majority of reading takes place either in a small group or in a whole class. And those opportunities simply weren't there for pupils during the pandemic. So, you know, it's no surprise. And if you're a pupil who finds reading difficult, then you're not going to be well motivated to be at home in order to carry on with your reading. So you'll have had some pupils who are reading loads during the pandemic and others who are reading very little, and that simply widened gaps between those with strong reading skills and those with weaker reading skills. So it's not a surprise, and it is obviously a concern. However, the good news is that what we discovered on our thematic visits was that where schools had identified specific skills gaps and had then put in place tried and tested strategies to fill those gaps, and that had been, you know, they were implementing those consistently because leaders had provided them with professional learning, so they knew why they were using those strategies, how to use them, when to use them, and so on. That when that was happening, once face-to-face teaching returned, then you see many pupils making rapid gains in those skills that they had lost. So it's far from a negative situation, but what we need is to see that kind of approach being used consistently, implemented consistently across Wales. Lindsay, interested to hear how you have tackled the impact of the pandemic on pupils' reading skills at Ysgol Bryngellion.
Thanks, Alan. Good afternoon, everybody. I think we recognised quite quickly that there were gaps in literacy skills, particularly reading, for the reasons that you've just described. And what we found in particular was an increased number of learners joining us in Year 7, for example, with reading ages of below 7, and quite large gaps in subject-specific knowledge. So to tackle the very low reading ages, we used the accelerated learning grants to second a primary school teacher. She worked alongside our Year 7 teachers, supporting planning and learning in the classroom, providing strategies and support for learners and staff who, as secondary school teachers, aren't really trained to teach children how to read. There's an expectation that they're further on when they come to us. So we needed those skills. And this provided them with the experience and the knowledge to differentiate for their classes in the future and to adapt for those who had been impacted most and for other year groups also. We used this expertise within a nurture group who were also supported with social skills and subject knowledge, disciplinary literacy too. It was difficult to strike the balance between accessing the school curriculum and developing subject knowledge, skills and experiences, and to support that progress in reading as well. As I just said, we did adopt some strategies to enable a focus on disciplinary literacy. You talked a little bit yourself then, Alan, about being aware of different subject-specific knowledge. For example, we used apps such as Reading Age on the iPad to be aware of and gauge the age range of a given text so that we could modify or pre-teach more complicated vocabulary to allow key learning to take place without barriers due to unfamiliar vocabulary. You talked then as well, Alan, about professional learning, and I do believe that is a huge addition that needs to happen. We had a professional learning inquiry group to trial an approach to reading non-fiction texts and worked with Gware as well on building reading power projects, trying different strategies such as reading 2 texts back to back to be immersed in the story and the characters before working on comprehension and task setting. But developing staff proficiency in identifying where interventions are relevant and planning for them through modelling and providing examples of work, planning and mutual observation, in addition to developing the literacy skills of staff, has also had an impact. We also had a renewed focus on regular evidence-based monitoring and impact to allow us to identify what wasn't working and what was. For example, we tried to introduce 20 minutes of reading a day and looked into some well-known external products, and it became clear quite quickly that neither of these worked for us, so we were able to adapt and change our path, improvement in the right direction. So I suppose ultimately we've managed to drive that improvement through extended professional learning for staff to enable them to plan and meet the needs of the specific learners that they have in front of them, and an implementation of a variety of strategies primarily focused on disciplinary literacy to enable access to the development of subject knowledge, skills and experiences. I hope that answers your question.
Diolch, Lindsay. I think there's quite a lot in that answer, but I think one of the key points you were making is about tailoring the provision to the children in your school. So I think there's a lot of good advice there. Okay, let's move on then to the next question. I can see a question has come through in Welsh, and it's a question about successful strategies to improve reading. So Heledd, would you be happy to take this one?
Good afternoon to you all. So we've seen through the report they use good strategies to improve reading. They were made to read books that were challenging, but also helping pupils to have access to these titles. We saw a lot to do with terminology and learning the terminology beforehand so that they understand the content of the book, and learning the content formally and informally, and being helped to use these words in different sort of environments. They also used different ways of learning to read, reading together, reading independently maybe. And another element that was important was get to understand how could they understand what they were actually reading. And maybe the last strategy was giving opportunities for pupils to practice their higher skills of reading. So modelling these skills then, so that they could give these pupils good feedback. So, Owen, how about you? What type of ways do you use in your school to improve pupils' reading? Good afternoon, everybody. So reading in our school starts with creating a culture, a reading culture, you know. And we used quite a lot of methodology, reading a story, the sounds that letters make, singing, in order to kind of develop their understanding further. When they move through the school, we use a group reading methodology with somebody leading it, which includes the teacher working with a small group of children who can read copy on similar levels. The content is easy enough and it's helped by adults, and this happens every day in the school, in every class. So when they get to the second year in school, we use reciprocal reading as part of the tasks that they undertake in the schools, in the class. This uses the skills of the pupils, and they work together to talk and discuss a story and to discuss what they've seen and heard. They use explaining skills, asking questions about what they've read, and they connect their literacy skills with a talking role as part of this group as well. What's important in Cyfarthfa is that we make it clear to the pupils what we expect to see with their reading. That staff have been given training, and there's weekly training available to staff to help them and to guide them on their way. And what's important as well is everybody does the same thing throughout the school. Thank you, Heledd.
Diolch, Owen, for that. We've had a couple of questions coming through about leadership, about the importance of the commitment of leadership, about whole staff buy-in, particularly when a school is facing so many priorities, and also one about what are the features of leadership that we've seen where we've seen some effective practice. So, Alan, this is all linked to, I think, recommendation 1. So I wonder whether you want to pick some of those themes up.
Okay, thanks, Claire. Yeah, I mean, one of the key messages from the report is about how crucial leadership is, senior leaders' buy-in, senior leaders' commitment to reading, understanding its importance, and then ensuring that it has a really high profile amongst staff and pupils on a continuous basis. So important. And I know the question was about, okay, how do you make sure, how do you enable leaders to do that? I mean, you know, we all know the importance of reading. I don't think anybody disagrees at all with the point that reading is critical to so much other learning. And therefore it would be a surprise if there were any leaders out there who didn't see reading as a priority. I mean, I sincerely hope that they do, and therefore it should be high on their agenda. I think sometimes maybe head teachers might delegate that responsibility to other members of the senior leadership team. And I think one of the things that the report suggests is that it really is, you know, it needs to come from the head teacher, if at all possible. You know, you can see that from the Ysgol Brynelian here and Cyfarthfa Park Primary School as well this afternoon, the commitment to making sure that reading is a priority. And then crucially, it's not enough obviously just to have it as a priority, but crucially then that careful strategies have been thought through, they're planned, they're coordinated, and then they are monitored when they're implemented, and they're evaluated on their impact. You know, those are really important points. So one would hope, I would say, that leaders have that buy-in. Obviously, leaders, if they haven't, can be reminded about the importance of reading in all other learning. And then the question also talked about whole staff buy-in. So, okay, if you're a leader who is wanting to develop that reading culture or to push out a program to develop pupils' reading skills, how do you get your whole staff to buy in? I think what Lindsay said earlier was an interesting one about disciplinary literacy and the approach taken at Ysgol Brynelian to really put the focus on the subject, but the subject understanding the importance of reading and other literacy skills in developing that subject. There's a lovely quote in the Education Endowment Foundation document about improving literacy in secondary schools, which I'm not sure if I've got this word right, but it talks about that subject leaders shouldn't be asking, what can we do for literacy, but what can literacy do for us? Because, you know, reading, if a pupil can read effectively in almost every other subject across the curriculum, they're going to be making more rapid progress. And I think Lindsay might like to come in here to in support of what I'm saying. Lindsay?
Yeah, I think I just wanted to add to that, Alan. You talked about buy-in, and that we found here that it's absolutely crucial that everyone understands how important reading is to their specific subject areas. You know, if you look at exams at the end, if you can't understand what you're being asked to do or how to interpret information, then you're going to struggle from the outset. But we found that it's the professional learning that goes along with it. You know, as secondary school teachers, we're trained in subject areas. You know, I'm a trained English teacher, so it helps. But if you're a maths teacher or a science teacher, we found that we've got to provide that professional learning to give people confidence to be able to tackle those reading skills within their own lessons and model these for them and give them that support for them to have the confidence to do it, working with our heads of department and other staff, also to identify areas of opportunity within their plans, within their curriculum that they have planned, and supporting them to be able to deliver that in a way that is actually going to not only use those reading skills within those subject areas, but improve those reading skills for that disciplinary area as well.
Okay, Alan,
Thanks, Lindsay.
did you want to come back in on that?
Yeah, I'd just be really interested to hear from Owen, because obviously he's a head teacher who has managed to get, I think, whole staff buy-in in his school, because when people visited, when inspectors visited Cyfarthfa Park Primary, they saw some absolutely outstanding practice there. So I'd be interested to hear from Owen how he managed to get that whole staff buy-in.
Thanks, Alan. It really started with some key members of staff who were really keen to look at alternative ways of developing reading and sending them on some key training. In fact, they went to a school in London where they were modelling certain ways of developing reading. Bringing them back then and selling the story to staff was key, and for them to see the benefits and for them to realise that children were going to be developing their reading skills, but also having a great deal of enjoyment from reading. There are also a knock-on effect as well in terms of children becoming far more independent, far more confident, and the skills that we were pushing through the reading development, they were going through the whole curriculum. So that the roles that they play or that they take part in when they're doing the reciprocal reading, they use those when perhaps they're having discussions in the playground or they're doing something in IT. So all those things, they cross the whole curriculum. And I think the staff could see the benefit. They are clear about what we expect to see them doing when there are reading sessions in class. And there is a support network in school. So they know that if there's an issue, they can turn around to one of the key members of staff and say, well, I wasn't sure how that was going to work. Can you help me out? And somebody would go in and support them. So that's really how we've developed it here.
Diolch, Owen. There's some really useful messages there. One about the importance of professional learning for staff, and looking at the impact, particularly on the confidence of pupils, and some comments about staff seeing the benefits in a visible way of this particular strategy. So diolch Owen. Okay, shall we move on to another question? It links really nicely to what we've been discussing about strategies, but this one is looking at the evaluation of reading strategies. There are some criticisms in the report, it says in the question, about the evaluation of reading strategies in both primary and secondary schools. So what are schools doing wrong? That's the question, Alan. What are schools doing wrong?
It's not so much what schools are doing wrong. I think it's the fact that not enough schools are evaluating, well, monitoring and evaluating robustly their reading strategies. So lots of schools are putting strategies in place. But what we're not seeing is a really rigorous and robust monitoring and evaluation of those strategies, because of course some strategies will work with some pupils and not with others, so you need quite precise evaluation in order to make sure that you're adapting what you're doing to try to ensure that all pupils are getting the benefit of that. Take, for example, if you introduced a policy which would be very sensible, a strategy such as using progressively challenging fiction and non-fiction texts across the curriculum. If you didn't introduce that at the same time as introducing evidence-based strategies and support to ensure that all pupils were able to access those texts, you could end up with a situation in class where you've got pupils who are not understanding the text, and therefore it's having a detrimental impact on them rather than a positive one. So it's just, I mean, it's not just about reading, is it? With all provision in school, if it isn't monitored carefully to be consistent, and if it isn't evaluated precisely and robustly to ensure it's working, then it's not as good as it could or should be.
Diolch, Alan. That's a good final question there. We are coming towards the end of our session. So thank you so much to the panel this afternoon, to Helen, to Alan, to Owen and Lindsay. Thank you to everyone who's joined us online this afternoon as well. We've hosted this particular Estyn Live event earlier in the day than we have previously, so we'd appreciate your feedback. Is the timing more convenient earlier in the afternoon? If you can and you have time, please take a minute to complete the poll in the chat box and share your thoughts with us about this session, but also some ideas of sessions and topics you'd like us to host in the future. So please take time. We'd really appreciate your feedback. Please have a good look at this particular report and previous thematic reports that we've published on our website, and let us know if you're finding them useful or if there's anything you'd like more of. Please keep an eye as well on our social media channels, as we are about to publish quite a few reports. So we've got a report on Welsh in initial teacher education that's being published next week on the 14th of September. We've also got a thematic review of ALN being published towards the end of September. I think it's on the 29th. And then we have in October the launch of our interim findings of the Chief Inspector's annual report. And there'll be findings from all the sectors that we inspect. So look out for that as well on the 12th of October. On our website, in our current vacancies page, you'll see that we're recruiting peer inspectors as well. On this particular campaign, we're looking for senior leaders from independent special schools, and the PRU sector. So if you're interested, have a look at the current vacancies page. And we are still aiming to have one peer inspector in every provider in Wales. So our peer inspector training will be ongoing. So if you're interested, keep an eye on our website. So on behalf of myself, Alan, Helydd, and the team at Estyn, diolch yn fawr I chi gyd. Thanks for joining today and hope you have a good week ahead.